Why would the Biden administration, why would the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, want to destroy Europe, which they've done? Why would they want that?
There's layered reasons for this. And let me continue to say something else, and then we'll recurse back to that because it'll help answer that question. So last March, I left the Darien Gap and I went back to Netherlands. They had elections. I was there for the elections. And then I went to Groningen gas field, which is in Netherlands. That's the biggest gas field in Europe. And I was warning that I think they're going to close Groningen next. And people said, you're crazy. And I said, well, I wasn't crazy about Nord Stream, was I? And now they've closed Groningen, right? Groningen is also closed now, right? And it wasn't destroyed or anything. They did it through information war. As you well know, the highest form of warfare is information war, bottom line, right? So it's information war that sets the table for these actions. So your question, why would they do this? Multiple questions. If the paradigm that I'm operating under is accurate, and it appears to be, it's highly predictive. By the way, since I was a young child, I was deeply immersed in physics. I always thought I would grow up to become a physicist, and that's all I cared about. I was basically failing school because I was just Rain Man on physics. So that's how I kind of learned my base thinking process, was reading people like Richard Feynman and that sort of thing, right? And one of the things that those very serious scientists of the day would say is if you have a theory and it's wrong, then throw it out. You may have to throw the whole thing out. So I call it the paradigm. So over time, since I was a young teenager, actually, I've always worked on paradigms that do two things. One is they don't leave me surprised, because if you feel surprised, and I don't mean waking up with a snake on your face in the jungle, that's a different kind of surprise. But if you feel surprised, then your paradigm is wrong, right? So you need to either tweak it or throw it out. Never get emotionally attached to your ideas. They're not that important unless they turn out to be right. And also your paradigm should be predictive, right? That's why when Biden was installed, I flew straight to the El Paso border and straight down to Colombia at the Darien Gap and straight to Panama at the Darien Gap. That's why I was at Darien Gap. That's why I was, thinking that they would do what they're doing now, which they're doing, which is increasing it and making it a major invasion route. That's why I've gone to BASF twice. That's why I was warning in writing and on interviews. I think something's going to happen to BASF, or to Nord Stream actually, which would cause BASF to crumble, which is as BASF goes, Germany goes. And I think that they were going to close, for instance, Groningen gas fields. Now they have, right? And it's all just based on listening to people like Feynman and running with it for the rest of my life, developing paradigms that never leave me surprised and and they're highly predictive, right?
So what you're describing is a war
now, under
against
the paradigm
West.
that I'm working under, there are clearly people trying to drive us into global famines. I started warning about global famine in January of 2020, right? It's clear that if you want to set the table for global famine, you want to knock out those nitrogenous fertilizers. That's one thing that you want to do. You want to take those off the table, because in 1914, when the Panama Canal opened, is actually when they also started doing the nitrogenous fertilizer production at the same year, 1914, at BASF at Ludwigshafen, Germany, right? So you see the world population starts to explode then. It didn't just explode because we had faster ships, bigger ships, and faster railways and that sort of thing, but that's part of it. It exploded for other reasons as well, like refrigeration and electricity, but also nitrogenous fertilizers is a huge part of it. So if you're going to cause famine, what would I do? Let's see, I would cause a war in Ukraine, right? That's one thing I would do. That's why I was over in Lithuania before the war in Ukraine, warning that something may happen. I was down in Morocco. I was watching Morocco push weaponized migration into Ceuta and Melilla. These are two Spanish cities that they're in Morocco. So you've got EU cities in Africa, right? So if you can get into Ceuta or Melilla, you're actually in the EU. So I was down in Morocco and watching them, basically needle Spain and the EU with weaponized migration. By the way, I want to be very clear. I'm not talking bad about Morocco. I love Morocco, and you're the first country who recognized us. I always thank Moroccans when I see them. And Moroccans always say, yeah, no Americans realized that Morocco was actually one of the first countries to recognize the United States when we declared independence. We have a long relationship. It's quite solid, right? But they definitely used weaponized migration against the EU and Spain, right? So I was down in Morocco, and we watched Frontex Frontex did a report. Frontex is sort of the EU equivalent of Border Patrol for the EU. They're basically useless. But they told us that the Belarus was trying to push migrants into Poland and Lithuania, right? So I lived in Poland for 2 years. And also I knew the Lithuanians quite well because I was with them in the war in Afghanistan. So I called up a senior officer in the Lithuanian army. I said, hey, I'm down in Morocco. Why is Belarus trying to push people into Lithuania? He said, fly up here and we'll take you to the camps. So the next day I was in Vilnius, sitting in front of top members of the government. I stayed there for 5 weeks. They gave me complete access to the camps. I was with them in Afghanistan, so that they knew who I was and that sort of thing. So it was quite helpful. So I got to interview many of the aliens coming in and their routes and that sort of thing. And as you see, when I was actually in Lithuania, I started to warn something's up. This weaponized migration didn't just come out of the blue, right? I mean, when you're doing information war and I always watch the information wars first, but weaponized migration is often a precursor for something bigger, right? But sometimes the weaponized migration is that is the main weapon. Like for instance, when I was in Tibet, hold on. Let me go back to China and I'll talk about weaponized migration. I love water. And the weaponized migration is it's an old weapon of war. It's been done since space and time. And Tibet, some of the Tibetan genocide, that's what it was. It was kinetic, of course, but a lot of it's just Han Chinese coming in mass. I mean, just moving in and elbowing. They're doing the same in Xinjiang right now with the Uyghurs, right? Now, when I was in Hong Kong, I got kicked out of Hong Kong. It was sort of famously kicked out of Hong Kong. I was a bad boy. But one of the ways that the Chinese Communist Party took Hong Kong was they weaponized migration. They were just bringing in Han Chinese every day, 100 to 150 or so per day. Not many, just enough to keep it below the threshold of making people go crazy. And they took positions as teachers, professors. They opened a Confucius Institute, of course. Politicians, police, that sort of thing, right? And so they slowly took over the cockpit until they just took Hong Kong. And so that's a low level form. I was just down in Honduras and for instance, I had dinner with a retired Army general there. He was like their chairman of the Joint Chiefs, actually. And I asked to have dinner with him. So we had dinner. It went on. And the reason I wanted to have dinner with him is because he's of Chinese descent. And I think it was his grandfather came to Honduras in 1923. And so he's what the Chinese Communist Party calls an overseas Chinese, right? And so the Chinese Communist Party works very hard in their information game to recruit people like that. So I had specifically asked to meet with this man because he had been invited to China, right? And he'd been invited there to the village where they said his family came from. They had a parade for him. They always do that. They had a parade for him. They took him to the graves of his family. They always do that as well. And then now they've had him in China 7 times. Now, as I talked with him for 3 or 4 hours that night over dinner in Honduras a few months ago, he said, China is not coming to attack the world. They're coming to become the world. And I said, exactly. Because again, I've written 3 books on Chinese information war. I could go on for days about it. But the bottom line is, I understand how they're doing this. I was just over in San Salvador. I know you've been over there talking with President Bukele. He's done a great job cleaning that place up. There's a big library downtown with a big Chinese communist flag waving out front. It's 7 floors. I was just in that library because I always go to libraries. I always go to museums. I always go to archaeological digs because I'm tracking the trailheads of information war. And by the way, that's why I went to Honduras, because the Chinese Communist Party is doing an archaeological dig there. They're trying to persuade all the Mayan Indians and others that you are actually descendants of Chinese because you came over the land bridge and then all these bad white Spaniards and everybody else came and took your land. So those are not called overseas Chinese. Those are called our cousins, right? So you see, for instance, a lot of information war is all about... Go ahead, sir.
Well, I don't even know if I can digest any. I think we're going to have to break this into multiple parts because there's so much going on. Hey, it's Tucker Carlson. The internet is crowded with interesting things that don't really matter. On TCN, we attempt to bring you interesting things that actually do matter, and a lot of them. Interviews, long form and short, videos, documentaries. You can find all of it on tuckercarlson.com, and we hope you will.